Okay, you can keep on now, please.
Well, the two lawyers, as I said, was Afro-Americans. Fine-looking men. Mr. Davis was fine-looking men as they are in this country. And Mr. John Gear, they was both wonderful. And what they did, they let me do the talking. And my sister, she didn't do much of the talking, but I helped the stand for about 2 or 3 hours.
That's a long time.
Explaining, the situation here in America and how the people, Afro-Americans, Jewish people, and all nationalities were treated. But they didn't like it at the courthouse for two black people to come in there and defend two white women. So we got out on bond, and ever since then, the judge here in Atlanta would not make my children's daddy support them because he went and pimped and his brother concerning me being a CP
Okay, cut.
believer.
Okay, now.
Okay,
Roll, speak.
Okay.
and hold it.
You have to speak a little louder to me.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Okay.
Nanny, explain to us about the conditions in the plant when you was a little girl, when you first went to work in the mills.
Well, the spinning and spooling, winders and twisters and drawing was it was a hard job. And of course, you was in a lot of danger. You know what I mean? The lint, but not like a weave shop. That's the worst part of the cotton mill is
The weave.
Is the weaving is what I
It still is
heard
today.
and estimate. And I learned a lot about different machines to operate, twisters and spinning, spooling, winders, quillers, but I never worked in the weave shop. But I got we made the beam, a beam. You know what a beam is?
Yeah, so it's
Okay.
a
Now,
Big round thread, long as this table. That's what they put on every weave.
One.
It's true. Cotton mill people was trashy. They called trash. They had they didn't care nothing about them. And the middle class people and people with good educations, they didn't pay us no attention.
so you were looked down upon.
Yeah, we was looked down upon, just a bunch of old trash. That's the way it was awful. But I didn't tell you enough of going back concerning the noise in the cotton mill.
Okay.
You know that.
Back at the conditions again, okay.
That condition is a cause of people having such a bad hearing, and also in the weed shop, it's the lint in it is. My brother lost his life, from weaving, had emphysema,
Okay.
and that's the way it is. They ain't no part of a cotton mill is too healthy. You know that, don't you?
So there was no safety precautions in the plant at
No,
all?
not whatsoever. Is no safety for nobody.
Have you ever seen anyone, or while you was working in the mill, did you ever witness a death? Did you ever see anyone get killed?
Well, out at you ever heard, since you've been in Atlanta, the Whitaker Mill?
Yes, I have.
Chattahoochee?
Right, I have.
Well, they took 'em out on stretchers there when my daddy and brothers and sisters worked in the cotton mill. They took 'em out on stretchers that they couldn't take it, you know, it was so hot, down on the river where it really is hot. And they kept the temperature so high. And cotton mills that used to make that blue denim for overalls for men. Well, they had the dye, you know, and all that old odor of the dye, we'd have to breathe it. And it was very unhealthy.
Now, when you went to work, and I would presume you had 8-hour days in the mills, or was it longer than
12.
12 hours. Did you ever get breaks, or did you have time
no
to
breaks.
eat?
Never no breaks.
And you said it was real hot. Was there any windows that you could get air?
Most of the mills that I worked in never opened the windows. They had to force them. My daddy and my brothers forced them out at Whitaker Mill, out at Chattahoochee River. They had to force the windows open there. I didn't work in the Chattahoochee but a short time. But they ain't none of the cotton mills what they cracked up to be. They might have changed a little, but it's awful hard work and unhealthy.
Okay, good.
I'm blocking the big.
No. The local flag.
when you're rolling.
We're rolling.
Okay, Mr. Brooks, could you tell us that story about President Kennedy?
Well, we had a problem, of course, in the South. I'd really rather start back and tell you something about the history of the South. See, before the war between the states, we don't call it a civil war down here. We call it a war between the states. We had 60% of the wealth of this nation. And after the war was over, we had nothing. We had no Marshall Plan to help us. In fact, all of the economics that developed was to impoverish the South. Because, for example, in the case of freight rates, it took twice as much to ship a manufactured product from the South to the North as it did to ship it from the North to the South, which meant they were going to keep the South as just a producer of raw materials and low income. Well, finally, we began to get some textiles moving down from the Northeast and from Massachusetts, for example. And of course, there was lots of discussion about what was bad for Massachusetts. And so, as you know, I was worked with a number of the presidents, and so I was talking with President Kennedy one day, and he said to me that he was not mad about it. In fact, he said I was upset when we started moving the factories from Massachusetts to Georgia. But actually what happened was that other industries moved into Massachusetts, which were higher paying industries than the textile industry. So he felt like they were winning instead of losing. So he said he wanted me to know he had no real ill feeling towards the South.
Good.
George,
Yeah.
could you hold just a minute?
Mm-hmm.
There's something funny about
We're up and rolling.
Do that again.
Probably, but
You would mind telling us that story again?
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Well, you lead it, you want me to start, or you want to lead it off, or what?
When we're ready.
Rolling.
Okay, you just start about the South
Okay.
before the Civil War.
Well, we, as you know, we do not call the war a civil war in the South. We call it a war between the states. Now, prior to the war between the states, the South was the wealthy part of this nation. We had 60% of all the wealth of this nation. But after the war, we had nothing. We were completely destroyed, and in addition to that, we were subject to lots of laws that were worked out which were very bad for the South. For example, in the case, in order to be certain that we did not industrialize, they had a law where it cost twice as much to ship a manufactured product from the South to the North as it did from the North to the South. So the whole idea was to make the South just a producer of raw materials, that we could not process these raw materials into the finished product and get much higher prices. So consequently, we went through a long period. We didn't have any Marshall Plan, and the Gone with the Wind story told at least part of our problems that we had at the South at that time. But at the same time, we eventually began to industrialize, and we moved some textile mills from the North, the Northeast particularly, to the South. Now, we moved some from out of Massachusetts, and I was advisor to a number of the presidents in economics, and so I was talking with President Kennedy one day, and he said he wanted to assure me he had no animosity towards the South because we were moving his textile mills out of Massachusetts to the South. He said that actually that worked out pretty good, that they had changed these industries in Massachusetts to where they had better industries with higher paid jobs, and so they gained, although they were upset when it happened, that they actually gained economically. And for that reason, he wanted me to understand that he had no feeling of animosity towards the South. So I think that was good because we all won in a way because we desperately needed all the industry we could get in the South at that time. My income was real low, wages were real low, and so consequently it was good for the South, but it worked out where it was all right for the Northeast.
Could you talk about the role of textiles before the Depression in the South and what was happening to the South's economy before 1929?
Well, we were having, beginning to have a weak economic situation in the South, really beginning in about 25. We began to go downhill. And we were already moving down by the time we had the Depression in 1929. Now, of course, 29 finished off everybody. And actually, we became the economic problem #1 of the nation. And when Roosevelt went in as president, we, of course, were in a poverty area. The per capita, for example, the per capita income of farmers in the state of Georgia went down to $72 for a year's work. And we had as much poverty as you have in Asia or Africa today. And so consequently, we had lots of serious troubles. As I've told you before, I was a professor of agricultural economics at the university, and I decided to leave the university with the hopes that I could change, help change this situation. Now, I didn't get much encouragement. Everybody thought my economic ideas were wrong, but anyway, they worked. And after I resigned from the university, the president, in order to entice me back, offered to jump me over people who'd been there a long time and double my salary and everything else. But the worst trouble I had was with my father. I'm sure I had fortunately cut off a year in grammar school and a year in high school and a year in college. And I started teaching in university when I was 19. And I'm sure he'd been all over town bragging about having a son who was a professor at the university at 19 years old. And when I told him I was leaving the university, he became very much upset. He got me in a room and sat me down and began to lecture me, saying that I was making the worst mistake I ever made in my life. That I thought, because of my training in agricultural science and economics, that I could change these farmers because they were starving to death. But what I did not understand was they'd a whole lot rather starve than change. and he said, "You can't change them." I said, "Well, I think I can." And he said, "Well, we're in disagreement on that." And I finally said to him I did not want a family row, that I felt like that I had to do this regardless. And so, as bad as that was, I think it encouraged me to work harder. And I worked about 18 hours a day to be certain that I didn't go broke and that I did improve the income of farmers, that I maybe doubled it, maybe quadrupled it, because they were doing many things that were wrong. Now, but we needed desperate at that time all the industry we could get in the South, and textiles was the simplest industry that you could get. As you know, it's a lot simpler than many of the complex industries that have come south in recent years. But in those days, the textile industry seemed to be the desirable industry because it was not too complex. So anyway, the South gradually turned from extreme poverty that we developed after the war between the states. And with no help, but I say, we didn't have any Marshall Plan, and so things were very difficult for us. But we've gradually, of course, brought the South up now to where the South is equal to about any part of this country and pretty well all over the world. I mean, we are good.
Now, you didn't explain to us what you did for the farmers.
Well, what we did, let me explain to you. For example, it seemed to me about everything he's doing was wrong as an agricultural scientist and economist. For example, the kind of fertilizer he was using. It took 12 to 1,400 pounds of sand to make it that sorry. You couldn't get it that poor unless you put that much sand in it. And yet he did not realize that he was buying sand, but that's what he was doing. He was not getting plant food that he thought he was getting, and he did not know that, but he was buying it because it was the cheapest. Sand was a whole lot cheaper than fertilizer. So what's happening, the fertilizer industry was really taking advantage of the farmer in that they were selling them this low quality product. It was terrible. And so one of the first things I did, that we've got to buy fertilizer plants, which we could buy cheap because they were broke too. They broke the farmer and the farmer broke them. And one of these economic circles going around and around, everybody broke. And so I could buy fertilizer plants very cheap. And then I said, we're going to take all the sand out of the fertilizer. We're going to make it high analysis. And then we want you to use twice as much as you've been using, and that's 4 times as much plant food. And we can double your yield. And so that's one of the programs we started. Another program, for example, it was in the case of corn. Corn was the largest row crop in the state of Georgia, more than 5 million acres. And yet the average yield of corn was 10.5 bushels per acre. It had been there for 50 years, had not moved. And I decided that if we're going to stop poverty and hunger, we had to change that. So we put in a program working with the colleges of agriculture and the experiment stations and the county agents and the vocational teachers. And we offered prizes in every county where a farmer, a 4-H boy or a grown farmer would produce 100 bushels of corn. We give him a prize. And so we put in this program, and we gradually brought the yield of corn from 10.5 bushels up as high as 86 bushels per acre. So we tacked poverty from many angles.
Well, one of the things that I'm curious about is that was at a time when so many of the people were leaving the farms desperate to come into the mills.
Everywhere they could get a job in a mill, it was so much more income than it was on the farm that everybody that could get off of the farm was getting off, and he was going into industry. And as you know, of course, we had quite a bit of our black population that went north. I mean, they went to Detroit and many other areas in order to get employment at much higher wages. But anyway, wherever we had industry, people would leave the farm in order to get a job. Well, actually, it was a supplemental income because there are lots of people who were farming, living on the farm, and part of the family were working in town, maybe in the textile mill. So it worked out quite good economically.
Well, were the New Deal farm policies forcing these tenants off the land?
Well, there was a good deal of discussion of that, but actually, I don't think that's correct. I think Roosevelt was anxious to get the income up. You see, he was coming down to the little White House, and he had first-hand knowledge. All he had to do was get out and ride, which he did, and he'd see lots of this poverty. And so he had an intense interest, I think, in raising the income of farmers, and did. Now, for example, I was at the White House when he decided to devalue the dollar, change the gold content of the dollar. Well, of course, the dollar is a commodity just like wheat or corn or cotton or anything else. And if you're going to do that, lower its value 40%, it meant the commodities would immediately move up 40%. And so consequently, he did a number of things that raised income of farmers. And that was one of the most dramatic things. And of course, when I was over the White House and learned that he was going to do that, it was a shock to me. I guess it was a temptation too, in a way, because as an economist, I knew the price of commodities was going up, and all I had to do was walk out of the White House and get on the board, and I could be rich. But I never did that. I worked with a large number of presidents, as I've told you, and I never violated my confidence at the White House.
Could you talk about Roosevelt and the textile manufacturers? I knew he knew a lot of them down at Warm Springs.
Yes, he knew lots of the textile people.
Could you start and say Roosevelt knew?
Yeah, Roosevelt knew a great many of them. The Callaway Mills, for example, were a big group there, and he knew the Callaways well. And so he had, I think, an interest in doing what he could to be helpful to the South. I always felt like he was doing all he knew how to do to be helpful. So he was intensely interested in industry coming to the South, and I think made a real effort to be helpful.
Now, there was a big strike in 1934, and there was an effort to get Roosevelt to intervene. Could you remember that strike?
I remember it casually, but I'm not really that familiar with it. I remember it was quite bitter in a way, and I think it was probably had to do with unionization. There were no unions hardly in the South, and probably the unions were trying to get into the South. Now, later on in life, I was involved. I was on the War Mobilization Board with President Truman, particularly during the Korean War, and we had the problem that they started to strike then. And I was the only one on the War Mobilization Board from the South at that time. And so they asked me really to handle that situation, which I worked with the union people and told them we could not permit that we just couldn't stand it in a war period. And so I met with the union people and explained the economics of the problem we had, that we needed these textiles during the war period, and regardless of all the complaints they had, that the first thing we had to do was go back to work, and then we could work out some of the problems. So I, in effect, insisted that they be back on the job on Monday morning, which they were finally agreed to do. And so we settled that one without any real terrible situation. I understood, but as I say, I was not too familiar with it. I understood back in '34 that the situation was quite bad. It was not nearly that good. But we settled it in the 51 or 2 in the Korean War. We settled it without any real troubles. I met with the union people, and we worked out an agreement. They'd go back to work, and then I said, then we'll talk about, well, what your problems are, but we can't talk about them. You're on strike.
Could you talk about co-ops? You said co-ops were something fairly new here, and you mentioned that that the blacks joined the co-ops and then they started voting. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, well, see, the co-op had never been successful in the South, and there had been a number of efforts, but they all had failed. And so consequently, when I decided that we could make a co-op succeed and help bring lots of income to farmers and do lots of things that you couldn't do without a co-op. Nobody seemed to agree with me, but I had spent considerable time really as an economist. I'd gone to the West Coast and worked with the Suncast, and I'd gone all the way into Canada. I'd gone to Denmark and Sweden and spent a summer with the co-op staff. And so I was convinced if you ran a co-op right, it could help raise the income level. Now, so consequently, that was one of the things I did when I left the university. I started the co-op in '33, and in order to bring greatly increase the income of farmers. Now, in doing that, I tried to make it into a very democratic institution, in that every member would have a vote, regardless of the size of farmer he might be. And that was unusual in the industrial world.